Hey everybody, this is Rosie, and today I'd like to do a little demonstration on how to make your own piping. So let's get started. To make our piping, you'll need to have some cording. I just have a scrap piece here. It can be as thin or as thick as you want your piping to be. And then we also need to cut out strips of fabric along the diagonal of the fabric. But before we can actually cut out our strips, we have to know how wide the strips need to be. Now the easiest way to do that is, here's the cording. You need to have enough fabric to wrap around the cording and then have enough for whatever your seam allowance is going to be. So I'm making a bag and the seam allowance is going to be 1/2 inch. So I want the seam allowance on my piping to be 1/2 inch. Now the easiest way to do that is to take your fabric, I just have a scrap here, and you're going to wrap this fabric right around that cording, okay? And now that I have the fabric wrapped around the cording, I just want to take a couple of pins and put them in there just to hold that cording in place for me for a couple of minutes. Okay? And then I'm going to take a ruler and I'm going to butt the ruler right up against that cording so that the cording is nice and tight in here, okay? And as I said, I want my seam allowance to be 1/2 inch. So I'm just going to make a few 1/2 inch marks with my ruler. Okay. And then once I have those 1/2 inch marks, I'm going to take another ruler and I'm going to cut along those marks right there. Right? Then I can take my pins out, and then I just want to measure how wide this strip is, and it is about 1.5 inches. So that means that to use this cording and have a 1/2 inch seam allowance for my bag, my strip needs to be 1.5 inches wide. So then you need to take a square piece of fabric. Now this piece here is 14 inches square. It doesn't have to be 14, it's actually better if you make it larger. The only reason why I'm doing 14 is because it fits into the camera better. Then once you have the square cut out, you're going to take it and fold it with the corners together. Okay? And in doing this, this is the diagonal of the fabric. Okay? So then the next thing that I do is take my ruler, and I'm going to start just by cutting 1/4 inch off of that folded edge. Okay, and we'll take that away. Then we want to cut strips that are 1.5 inches wide. Okay, and then you would just keep cutting 1.5 inch strips. Now by cutting out our diagonal strips, what we've actually done is we've cut our strips along the bias of the fabric. And what that's going to do is make this nice and stretchy. The bias always has stretch, okay? The selvage side does not have very much stretch at all. And the reason why we want to have stretch is because as you're putting in your piping around a curve, it will ease in very nicely. Now, after you have your strips cut, you need to sew all of your pieces, all of your strips end to end. So what you can do is take the top strip and you'll bring it over to this end right here. Okay, And you'll sew them with about a 1/4 of an inch seam. Now you want to stagger it a little bit so that you have some dog ears. Okay, so you'll be sewing right from this corner to this corner right here, and the strips should form an L. Okay, so this is the way it should look. And then once it's sewn down, all of these stripes will be going in the same direction. Okay, that's if you're using a directional fabric like I am. Now also remember, you want to keep in mind how long you need your strips to be. You don't want to have a lot of short strips sewn together. And that's going to depend on the size of your project and how much you need. If you were doing a quilt, you'd want to have some very, very long strips. And you might use 1 yard or more of fabric to create your square. So now we're going to go over to the sewing machine and sew this across, and then I'll show you how to sew in the cording. Now I'm going to sew the two ends together, and I'm using some red thread, which will hopefully help you to see the project better. Okay, so I'm just going to put down my presser foot, and this is cotton quilting fabric. I'll sew it together with a stitch length of about 2. And I'll just go straight across. Okay, so you can see right there how this was sewn together. And then of course you would press this back and you would cut off the little dog ear that forms, okay? And you'll sew all of your strips together in that same manner. Now the next thing is to lay in the cording to make the piping. So we're going to change the foot on the machine over to a zipper foot. You can use whatever type of foot you have. Some machines have piping feet. You can use those, or you can just use a regular zipper foot. They'll both work just fine. Now I've gone ahead and taken the regular foot off of my machine, and this is my zipper foot. Okay, it's the one that came with this machine. In the back there's a little green knob there, and I can loosen that knob up, and when I loosen it, this piece will slide back and forth. Okay, and the reason why you want it to slide is because it sets the position of the needle for you. So I'm going to put it on the machine here and tighten the screw. So right now this is set so that the needle would sew on this side of the foot, and then if I slide it over, now the needle will sew on the opposite side of the foot. And then you have a finer adjustment where you can make this go as close or as far away from the needle as you want it to be. Alright, so I'm going to drop my needle down right now, and then I want to set this so that it's not butting up against the needle, but I just want it to be a little bit away from the needle. So I'm going to tighten it up. Okay, and now we'll get ready to start sewing in that piping. So now to sew in the cording, you're going to lay the cording right in the center of the strip, and then you'll fold it over the cording here. You'll fold the strip over the cording. You want your edges to be even, okay? And then you're going to put it underneath the presser foot. And you're going to start sewing down the length. And you want to trap that cording in between those layers there, okay? Now, you want the cording to be snug up to the fold, but on the first pass, we don't want to sew the cording in too tightly. We want to be a little bit loose with it. Just increasing my stitch length to 2.5 here. So I'm just going to sew, and the cording will be a little bit loose. Just make sure that you keep your edges even. Okay, and we don't need to go too far with this because it's just a little demo. Okay, so if I take it out, you can see it's sewn in, it's holding the piping against that fold, but it's not real tight. It's not real tight up against the cording here, okay? So now we're just going to make a little sample sewing it into a project. So now I have a scrap piece of fabric here that I'm going to sew the cording on. And right now we would like this foot to be a little bit closer to the fabric. So what I'm going to do is loosen up that green knob again. And I'm going to drop down the needle. Then I'm going to move the needle in closer to that notch, but not butting up against the notch, just a little bit away from it. Okay, and then you're going to tighten up your knob. Now, of course, if you're doing this on a computerized machine, you wouldn't be moving this around. You'd be moving your needle position left and right. Okay. And then we'll butt the edges of the piping up to the edge of the fabric here and slide it in. And now when we sew, we really want to hug that piping a little bit more. And ideally, the stitching line that we create now should be closer to the piping. So this will become the outer line of stitching, and then there'll be an inner line of stitching. So just snug it up. I went off the edge a little bit there, but that's okay, it's just a demo. Okay, and now you can see that that inner line is closer to the cording than that first line was. Alright, and it's the cording is in here much tighter now. So now what we'll do is take another piece of scrap, okay, and we will clip those together. Alright, just take a couple of clips to hold it in place. And this time when we sew, we want to sew right on that red line, okay? You can sew in a little bit farther than the red line, but you don't want to sew on this side of the red line. If anything, you would want to sew on this side of the red line, but ideally you want to sew right on top of that red line. And then when you're done, these two red lines are right on top of each other. And when you open it up, you have some really beautiful piping. Okay? And that's what it should look like. So that's it. I hope that this was helpful to you. Please like and subscribe.